Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese, and thank you for joining me as always. Across the way, Mr. Jeff Abercrombie. Jeff, welcome back into the saddle this evening.
Hey, Paul, how's it going? Fresh off vacation, got a little tan. Now it's really time to dig into the oncoming class. But I think before we do so, we have a nice guest today.
Yeah, absolutely. And here at Saturday to Sunday, we are ready to turn the page fully to the All-Star circuit, the college prospects, and get ready for the NFL draft. But last week and now this week, bringing on some guests from the industry to kind of recap the NFL season from a rookie perspective, some thoughts heading into the offseason, maybe some guys who are buying, selling. And today we're really privileged. First time here at Saturday to Sunday is Mr. Hayden Winks from Underdog Fantasy. Hayden, thank you for joining us here at Saturday to Sunday today.
Can't wait for it. Like you, Jeff, I'm always looking for a nice tan out here and then also grinding some prospect tape. So we're on the same page. Glad to be here. Glad to be talking to you guys.
Absolutely, absolutely. And, anybody, I'm sure most of our followers are following the work that Hayden is doing over at Underdog Fantasy, him and Josh, the podcast, all the videos they do. Excellent work, guys. Make sure you're checking them out for sure. So, Hayden, let's get right into it and let's kind of look at this running back class. And it was an interesting year, right? Because we had glimpses of Breece Hall being fantastic. We had some great performances by Kenneth Walker. And I believe it was you and Josh talking him up a lot before the season started, that he was a really interesting best ball pick. And people were kind of, sleeping on him a little bit. So why don't we just start there? Those guys. I know the sample size was small for Breece Hall and it took a little while for Kenneth Walker to really find the stride. But what do you kind of make of those guys? Their ceilings maybe going forward. It's a little bit difficult with the Breece Hall injury, but how are you kind of looking at those two guys? Do you have a clear preference between the two in terms of dynasty? Does the injury to Breece Hall kind of, mutter the waters a little bit?
Yeah, so I think for right now, I'm still weighing what their prospect profiles look like just in general. 1 year, I'm weighing that a lot, but we have to keep in mind what they were like as prospects. My model had both of them in the 90th percentile or above. I looked at both of these backs as great options. I thought we kind of galaxy brained a little bit of the Kenneth Walker evaluation because of his receiving profile. And there were still some of those limitations in the NFL as a rookie, but his rushing profile I thought was electric. That's what he kind of looked like to me in the NFL. And then we actually lucked out with Ken Walker going into a good offense, not a bad one like we thought. So for this next year, I have both Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker as fantasy running back ones. Breece Hall, it sounds like he's ahead of schedule. And to me, there was nothing about their rookie tape that makes me even less pessimistic. I was super optimistic coming into this, and there was nothing I saw from either one of those backs. I think neither of them are complete players. Like I would say Kenneth Walker, still the receiving game. He's very inexperienced with that. He's definitely going to always be a boom bust rusher, but give me those types all day. And that Breece Hall, towards the end before he tore his ACL, I thought he was starting to have a better feel for the game. I thought his vision could be hit and miss, both as a college player and then as a rookie, but their game breaking juice, I think both of them will be top 10 running backs for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we saw from Hall and from Walker this year is exciting because I think we are starting to see some of the old guard at the running back class maybe take a step back. Guys like Alvin Kamara and other players like that, and I think Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker are two guys that are clearly moving up. I think an interesting discussion, I wasn't planning on going here, but it just kind of popped in, is people were really high on Javonte Williams last offseason going into it. Maybe if you have ranked, if not a big deal. We just talk through it. But like, where do you think yourself and maybe even the industry kind of fitting Javonte Williams in with those two guys now? Like, because I feel like Javonte Williams was like catapulting. I was a little bit more reserved. I had him like 7-8 in my dynasty ranks before the season started, but I know he was higher, much higher for some people. But now that injury, we still haven't seen him be like this elite player nor carry a heavy workload. How do you kind of see Javonte Williams compared to those guys as we return the page to the offseason?
So I thought both of Breece Hall and Kenneth Walker profiled better than Javonte Williams as a prospect. I was still pretty optimistic with Javonte. Unfortunately, there is a big difference between Breece Hall and Javonte's injury. Breece Hall, luckily, it seems like it's a clean ACL, just the ACL, and he does seem ahead of schedule. Javonte Williams, I believe it was ACL, MCL, and PCL. I think it was 3 torn ligaments. And that's what the difference between like J.K. Dobbins' ACL injury and some of these other running backs that could kind of come back. So I'm actually pretty concerned with Javonte Williams. Also, now we have to price in that Russell Wilson is going to be there for at least this next year, possibly 2 more years. And I don't think anyone's very optimistic with that. And I think that there's a chance that with Breece Hall, maybe you get like really lucky and Aaron Rodgers comes into town. But even if like it's Derek Carr or someone like that, that would still be a massive upgrade. And that I think that offense could be pretty sweet. So I have right now, this is just for 2023 rankings, but kind of on par with dynasty stuff. I have Javonte Williams as my running back 25. I have Breece Hall as my running back 7 and Kenneth Walker as my running back 5. So I think there's a pretty big gap between them. I think most of it is because of the injury, though.
So one follow-up. I mean, you said Kenneth Walker, you're running back 5 over Breece Hall, running back 7. I mean, we're nitpicking there. But, I also had a follow-up too. You said we galaxy brained a little bit talking about, his receiving profile as a prospect. And, we're big fans of when talking about players entering the NFL, it's not about what they can't do, just what we haven't seen. And, it's not like Walker had a particularly prolific pass catching season this last year, but he had a game with, 6 catches, 8 targets. It's not like Seattle was afraid to use him in that role. And do you anticipate that work will pick up as we go? Was there anything that was concerning you about his potential usage going forward? Or is it really just, Seattle was better than we thought they'd be? We think they'll be pretty stable and potentially able to take a step forward. And there's just more safety in projecting what we expect for Walker next year and potentially moving forward.
So he caught basically all the passes that were thrown his way. It wasn't like this was a massive drop issue for Kenneth Walker. I think where we kind of won, if you were betting on him and his profile looking better in the receiving game, is the Seahawks were like top 5 in neutral pass rate. And I think that most people were projecting them to be bottom 5. We had all the Pete Carroll narratives. Well, they got completely squashed. It was like the anti-let Russ cook. It's the let Geno cook. And all of a sudden we have a more pass attempts than we were expecting from here. We'll see who they bring in as to be his complement, but he's basically going to absorb all of the ground game. And I do think that 40, 50 targets is within his range of outcomes. Underdog is half PPR, so I don't care about the receiving stuff all that much when it comes to the running backs. Obviously, it is very nice to have it, but it is not an end-all be-all. And for prospect profiles, just looking at some of the correlation that I've seen, the career receiving yards per game is very, very minuscule when it comes to projection from college to the NFL fantasy points. And if you just look at total yards or even half PPR points per game from their college, those metrics are so much more predictive than just the receiving stuff. So I was looking back at Kenneth Walker's profile, and he was crushing when it comes to scoring touchdowns and rushing for a bunch of yards. And when you look at the PFF metrics or watch the tape, he's breaking so many tackles. So this wasn't just about the scheme. He was creating for themselves. So I think there is a buying opportunity when some of these running backs are 1,500-yard running backs, but they only caught 15 passes. I think we need to be buying those types, especially in a Michigan State type of offense. Some of these Big Ten running backs don't catch many passes. We've seen it with Melvin Gordon and some other backs in those types of conferences where all of a sudden they're just getting the ball because that's what the offense is built for. And Kenneth Walker, by the way, who's averaging 6.5 yards per carry. You don't really need to throw the ball if your running back is doing that.
Yeah, and I think we hear at Saturday Sunday say it often that sometimes we try hard not to downgrade somebody who maybe just hasn't been asked to do it. And I think you made a great point there that Michigan State just didn't ask him to really do it. So I think he showed a little bit this year that he was functional, and that's good enough, right? No one's going to confuse him with Christian McCaffrey, or even Breece Hall or somebody like that. But functional goes a long way. He's more involved, and he will be more involved than a guy like Nick Chubb has been. So I think that's important for his value in terms of redraft dynasty and moving forward. The last 2 running back questions we'll group like this. Let's the guys who I think are going to profile more as part of a committee, most likely more between the tackles in terms of early down runners. Damian Pierce carried a heavy workload at times this year. I'm not sure if that's going to be sustainable. I'm sure they're looking for a lot of upgrades. So we'll group Damian Pierce in here, Brian Robinson, who slowly took over that backfield in terms of the majority of rushes with, Antonio Gibson finding a role, as the season went on. Isaiah Pacheco obviously saw a lot of work for Kansas City down the stretch. And then Tyler Algier, who I think is going to be a guy that, unless the Falcons make an early investment in the draft, I don't think they go the free agency route. I could see a lot of people maybe steaming him up a little bit. Maybe talk us through some of those guys, things that who might have impressed you. Maybe even you were talking about going back to your profiles on these guys. Was there one from that group before that clearly stood out compared to the other ones? And maybe just as you head into the offseason, is there one or two from this group that you would want to be actively maybe trying to acquire, or maybe an opportunity to sell if maybe you think this is the most use a guy like Damian Pierce will ever get? How you kind of making sense of these guys?
So as prospects, this entire kind of group was in like the 60th percentile range, looking at drafted running backs over like the last decade or two. So this was definitely in the kind of boom bust, definitely committee style backs, and they didn't have the draft capital. So someone like James Cook was drafted a little bit earlier than we were expecting, but he's smaller, and I think it's gonna be harder for him, especially in that offense that is so pass heavy. And with Josh Allen at the goal line, it's gonna be hard for him to kind of ever profile as like some stud fantasy running back, in my opinion. And then those other guys, like Tyler Algier, looked to me pretty damn good. The problem is he was a fifth round pick. So there's always this kind of like Michael Carter going back to last year, where I thought Michael Carter had a good rookie season. And all of a sudden, guess what? You weren't drafted high enough. In comes Breece Hall. Now, the difference is, and I think why I'm most bullish on Tyler Algier is I have a lot of faith in Arthur Smith calling a hell of a ground game. And Tyler Algier was very good in it. And they have a bunch of other problems on defense in particular. And obviously, they're going to upgrade the quarterback spot, where I think I'm probably most bullish on Tyler Algier. And I think he's a fine player. I don't think that he's exceptional, but his averages were very good. And even some like the yards after contact and elusiveness rating was probably better than what I thought it was going to be. But I think for the Falcons this next year, we're going to see a massive quarterback upgrade, even if it's like Ryan Tannehill type. I think it's a big upgrade. And I really just have a lot of faith in Arthur Smith calling it. So of that grouping, I think I have Algier ranked the highest. And then like Damian Pierce and Brian Robinson, I think they're fine. I just don't trust the scheme, the organization, their quarterback upgrades as much as I will with Atlanta.
Yeah, I mean, I love that you mentioned Arthur Smith's running game, because I mean, you're one of the only ones who I hear really talking about it, and it's something I think about every time I, listen to, anybody analyze anything coming out of Atlanta or coming out of the rookies. Maybe just one other name to throw in there. So it sounds like Algier's kind of been your preference of that group, but one name we didn't mention here was Rachaad White. And I do think we've got a pretty decent chance at some changing of the guard in Tampa Bay. Do you think White, I believe it was a third round draft capital too. So we're talking day 2 draft capital, not day 3. That's generally okay for rookie running backs. And he seemed to show down the stretch. Now, we might not have Tom Brady checking down all the time, but we might also not have Leonard Fournette. What do you did Rachaad White do anything to give you any confidence next year? Are you just staying away from that situation entirely? What are your thoughts on him?
So I liked Rachaad White as a prospect, not loved him, but I thought that he was in the mix to be the running back 3. And he might actually have been my running back 3 before the draft got settled. I didn't really like his tape, though, to be honest, as a rookie. I thought he ran a little bit more hesitation than I thought. I didn't ever see him really finishing drives or runs. I think he can play in all phases, but I do wonder, what is his actually true skill set? And if you're looking at PFF, they have yards after contact. There's 69 qualifiers. He was 64th in yards after contact per carry among running backs this year. And his elusiveness rating was also bottom 10. So I'm not sure what the kind of bull case for him is based off of his tape. I think he's going to be a committee member, and I think he can play in a mini bell cow type of role because can play in the pass game, and they use him in all situations. But even if they do release Leonard Fournette, like I expect based off the salary cap, who's coming in at quarterback? Who's going to be calling plays? This team, their salary cap situation for the next couple years is going to be really bad because they went all in for the last 2 years and they kept extending and restructuring contracts for these older players to try to win a Super Bowl. You have to pay the price eventually. And who's going to be signing up to play the quarterback for the Buccaneers? They're not going to have any money to spend. So maybe you can read into that and say he's not going to have that much competition because they just can't pay for any other running backs. But at the same time, eventually you have to show it on tape. And to me, Rachaad White kind of was the underperformer based off of what I thought he was coming into the league versus what he put on tape last year.
Yeah, I think Rachaad White's an interesting one, and it'd be interesting to kind of see how the dust settles there in Tampa Bay. You mentioned him briefly before. I just want to circle back real quick to James Cook. I think the Bills are going to upgrade at the wide receiver position. I think running back might be a little bit of a luxury that they rather fortify the line, and they got some upgrades on defense. And I think prioritizing another, better wide receiver, maybe to push Gabriel Davis down to be their third. Do you see we sort of integrate James Cook a little bit more down the stretch of this year? Would you anticipate that continuing next year if they don't add another, significant piece, let's say either, in the first 2 days of the draft or in free agency? And if so, do you think there's a path for him to have some fantasy viability or mostly PPR leagues only? I know you were talking half PPR, a little bit different in terms of what you saw from Cook and what his profile was prior to him being drafted.
So I thought his profile was kind of interesting, and he's definitely got some bursts, but I didn't see like some massive difference maker. And he went a little bit earlier than I expected, which is a good thing for him. I currently, for this next season, have him as the running back 31, assuming Devin Singletary leaves and they bring in some other competition. I just don't think that he has enough size or like the same burst as like Dalvin Cook, for example, to kind of shoulder like, I don't know, 200, 250 carries. So you're hoping for like a JD McKissick type of season where you get 150 carries. They're very efficient. And then you can catch 50, 60 passes. Will Josh Allen throw the ball to his running back that often? I'm not sure. I'm with you guys that I think they are going to address both the running back and wide receiver position. I think he's going to be okay. I think that he's like a flex guy. It's bye week time. Throw him in there. If your dynasty rosters have a bunch of starting spots, he has value. But for like underdog, a half PPR best ball, I think he can kind of be fake gold where it comes to just what is his true ceiling here. I'm not sure if he's going to be a bell cow back. And I'm not even sure if the Buffalo Bills even want that.
Yeah, and even when Singletary's had some good spots, it's not consistent, right? We know Josh Allen is going to get a lot of the goal line looks. It's not all that similar than when Cam Newton was at his best in Carolina, right? They had a good run game, but it didn't really consistently translate besides like that, that 1 year maybe with D'Angelo Williams and Jonathan Stewart way back when or whatever. But like in terms of like then with the Cam Newton era, yeah, he had McCaffrey that 1 year, but when it wasn't, somebody an elite level player, he just took a lot of those touchdowns inside the red zone, inside the 10, 5, whatever. And I think that's similar to what we see in Buffalo for sure. So let's transition this over to the pass catchers, and we'll start with the wide receivers. Really interesting year. We saw a lot of these rookies have some real peaks and then had some valleys, a lot of quarterback issues with a couple of these guys for sure. So why don't we start, what is it? Chris Olave? Is it Wilson, Drake London? Who kind of, as this year kind of concluded and we headed to the offseason, is there one guy from the group or two guys that you're like, these are the two that if I was really going to pick who could maybe turn into a star, who could be a top 10, top 12 type guy, this would be the guy that I think maybe it could happen. If it's not next year, maybe in 2 years. Is there one or two from this that you feel strongly about that could maybe reach that peak of a level?
So the three that you named, Olave, London, and Wilson, to me are like the stud members of this class. I wasn't really a big Treylon Burks guy. I don't think he really showed anything. Jahan Dotson, I think, has a role in the NFL, but I'm not sure if he's ever going to be the guy. Christian Watson looked electric. There's going to be some quarterback concerns if Aaron Rodgers gets traded. Who knows with him? Some of his metrics were a little bit less sticky than I would like. But to me, Drake London and Garrett Wilson seem like the two that could have 150, 160, 170 target seasons. They just look like completely dominant players when it comes to just drawing targets. Both of them can win underneath and the intermediate level. I think that both of them can be alphas. Chris Olave is kind of interesting because he's kind of like, I don't know, maybe like Tyler Lockett. I haven't thought about like the exact comp, but like more, maybe he's going to be a 120 target guy, very efficient on them, very, very valuable, but he's going to be more of a wide receiver too and consistent. So I came into this thinking that Drake London was the number one receiver in the class, and I thought Garrett Wilson had the chance to be if he could develop a little bit more. My comps for those two is I think that Garrett Wilson could kind of be like Odell Beckham was kind of his like peak. And I thought that Drake London can turn into like Michael Thomas. So those are kind of the comps I had for the top three.
Yeah, super high praise. I love that you just put the Tyler Lockett name out there with Chris Olave, because I just ran a poll like this last week and, polled the Twitterverse of what they would think if that was Chris Olave's career. And, I think, a lot of people might feel slightly disappointed if that's the real, like if that's your reality and that's what you get. But people don't realize that Tyler Lockett's coming off of 5 straight top 15 finishes.
Yep.
It's just that he's not going to be, I just, without the yak, without that absolute, I think he's a dominant route runner, and maybe at the peak you get something like Calvin Ridley pulled out.
Yep.
But you're not, I don't know that there's an avenue for him to enter a Jamar Chase style, elite. I don't think, unless he develops things that we just haven't quite seen yet, even in his collegiate profile, to maybe get to like an Antonio Brown style dominant season. And he'd have to be a focal point, and he'd need the quarterback. But he's one of my absolute favorites. I mean, I think he's about as safe as they come, where I think maybe the other guys carry a little bit of risk. You touched a little bit on a few of these other names that I absolutely love, like Christian Watson, I think is the ultimate wild card. I mean, Jahan Dotson was a guy that we absolutely loved we put him in the same tier as all of these other 5 players. If you were to go, who's the next guy up? Is it Dotson? Is it Watson? You mentioned
Pickens.
I was going to say, you mentioned you weren't a fan of Burks. Is it Pickens? Or is there really somebody kind of under the radar that, you really, maybe they're not even wide receiver 4 for you, but you see them as such a value and being slept on, that's the type of target that you'd really be looking for?
So I think Jahan Dotson is pretty interesting, but I think that he kind of runs in some of the similar problems that Olave has, I think just at a lower level. But like Curtis Samuel is a potential cut or trade candidate, so that could kind of quicken up the pace here. We don't know what the quarterback situation is going to be for the Commanders, but I can tell you with almost certainty that it will be a quarterback upgrade this year. I'm not a big fan of Heineke. Obviously, nobody likes Carson Wentz. So even if it's like Jacoby Brissett, which I think is about the floor here, I think that, and if Curtis Samuel gets moved on from, I think all of a sudden Jahan Dotson could be maybe more of like a weekly wide receiver 3. I think that's kind of what we're hoping for with him. George Pickens and Christian Watson, I would probably rank higher just because I'm looking for somebody to be a top 20 wide receiver. And I think maybe that they're like boom bust profiles could like maybe leave them with a little bit lower floor, but ultimately we got to be chasing ceilings at some point. And I think that Christian Watson showed it with athleticism. And we just look at, if you just kind of extrapolate those numbers from the back half of the year, you're looking at somebody that could be a top 20 wide receiver as soon as this next year. And then George Pickens, to me, very inconsistent player. I didn't love that the Steelers are sticking with their OC. I thought they kept asking Pickens to do the same exact thing. And maybe that's a chicken or the egg situation. Maybe is that Matt Canada's problem, or is it a George Pickens problem? Because a lot of the same routes that he's running this last year were the same type of routes that he was winning with at Georgia. I just think that there's some chance that he can kind of develop more than that and be a number 1 wide receiver. And Deontay Johnson, I think best profiles as kind of like a number 2 target, win underneath. I think there is a true alpha eventually. It could be with George Pickens. And I think that we've given Kenny Pickett a lot of crap. I think that if you're just kind of polling how good is Kenny Pickett, I think that the actual reality is he's a little bit better than what people are thinking. So maybe you can buy the dip on that as well.
Yeah, a couple follow-ups. I do want to just circle back to the big three for 1 second. Do you think it's as simplistic, if you like them all, that in terms of dynasty, you would gravitate them or rank them based on maybe quarterback upgrades this offseason? Is it close enough that you would say, based on maybe who, if any, I would think all those teams are potentially in the market for changing of the quarterbacks. Do you have them close enough, you think, that you could make your decision based on how the quarterbacks kind of play itself out in New Orleans, New
Yeah.
York, and Atlanta?
So I think that New Orleans is going to have the toughest time finding a franchise guy because of lack of draft picks, and then also their cap situation is really bad. Once the Falcons cut Mariota, I think they're going to have like $83 million in cap space, and I think that Arthur Smith has a couple years to build this thing out. So if it's like Ryan Tannehill or Derek Carr for the next 3-4 years, I think that's plenty enough for Drake London. I also think that the Falcons can't draft another skill guy with elite draft capital. They have to just say Drake London, Kyle Pitts, those are our two guys. We got to address the edge rushers and corners group and all, maybe find a rookie running back. So I don't think there's going to be a rookie quarterback. I don't think there's going to be more competition for Drake London. I think the only upside is for better quarterback play. And then with Garrett Wilson, similar situation. They have like $50 million to spend after they release like Corey Davis and those types. I think that they're a pretty attractive destination for Rodgers for 2 more years, even if it's Derek Carr. I think that's going to be okay with him. So I would rank them for quarterbacks moving forward, like London and Wilson, pretty much the same. And I would put a tier below. I think it's going to be harder for the Saints to find a franchise guy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And why don't we round out the wide receiver conversation with a couple final names? One was, what are we all to make, and what's your take on Sky Moore? I know the hype for him was very high before the season started here at Saturday Sunday. We liked him as a player. We thought the how high people were pushing him for all levels of fantasy got a little bit wild, and it wasn't like Kansas City was loaded receivers this year, and they really didn't show a lot of want to get him heavily involved. They made the trade for Kadarius Toney, which I'm a big fan of that, even though he for whatever reason can't get himself on the field for a lot of percentage of the plays. I think we'll see if they bring back Juju. They were playing Mecole Hardman clearly over Sky Moore, and he was actually having some really strong performances prior to his injury. As we head into this offseason, is he a guy that, do you think still could be in Kansas City's plans to be relevant, or do they look at him and kind of say, maybe we missed on this one, and they're not really looking at him as to be an integral part of that? And then maybe some thoughts on Wan'Dale Robinson. I know not really ideal for half PPR, but I mean, he was coming away. He was coming around a little bit. His best game was the game he tore his ACL in. We saw games that Richie James was really good in the Brian Dable offense. I think Wan'Dale would have done a lot more with that. So maybe some thoughts on Sky Moore and Wan'Dale Robinson and the wide receiver discussion.
So both of them kind of fall into something I always look for are these wide receivers playing in 2 wide receiver sets? Are they playing in 1 wide receiver sets? Because if you're a slot only player, that means that you're going to be competing with at least 2 other wide receivers plus a tight end plus a running back. And it's really hard to win in the slot only. Your ADOT's low and you're competing with actual wide receivers. And I think both of these guys could kind of fall into this situation where Wan'Dale Robinson, I think, definitely a true slot. Sky Moore, I think most likely he's going to be a slot wide receiver. Just looking at it, he played 50% of his snaps in the slot this year. And then if you extrapolate the Sky Moore stuff, I think Juju's going to be gone. He hasn't done anything really in Kansas City. I think MVS is a cut candidate. Mecole Hardman's out of the way. But the Kadarius Toney profile and the Sky Moore profile are somewhat similar. Now, I think the upside case for Kadarius is that he can win on the outside. I'm not sure if Sky Moore has enough juice. I was kind of surprised watching him as a rookie. They would try to get him schemed up this entire year, and none of them really broke free all that much. So I'm a little bit nervous for Sky Moore. I didn't see any type of plays that really made me too intrigued. I would rank Kadarius Toney ahead of Sky Moore. I don't know where the dynasty community is on that, but I would rather take an upside chance on Sky Moore or on Kadarius over Sky Moore.
Yeah, I feel I would fall in the same boat personally, but we've seen more from Kadarius Toney even in limited limited games, limited reps, but a lot more risk. Still, it's one of those ones where like you said, we've seen him on the outside, and we've seen what we can do in a single game. So I think that gives us a pretty good wrap on the wide receivers, and this hasn't been some legendary tight end class, but we can have legendary tight end prospects that we wait on for 3 or 4 years now, right? And still waiting on you, Kyle Pitts, but we did have a few players make some names for themselves, games here or there, right? So we had Dulcich come on a little bit mid-season. We had McBride show up. We had Daniel Bellinger kind of come in for the Giants, get hurt, come back a little bit. How do you view the tight end position for these rookies as a whole? Do any of them profile as, it's really hard. Anybody can be a tight end one, right? You get a touchdown, you're a tight end one. Good job, right? But are any of these guys somebody you feel might be able to slot into that tier behind the upper echelon starters? Those, okay, so there's Kelsey, there's Andrews, and then you got kind of the Kittle, Goddard, Hawkinson, right? So maybe like we'll just say anybody that you feel could just break into that second, third tier that you just feel comfortable saying, hey, I've kind of plugged the leak, I'm good to go, this can be an every week starter. Yeah. Or do they fit more in this realm of, hey, this is a guy that I know as a backup, I feel reliable to be able to plug in. He's not my every week starter, he's not plugging a hole, but he's a good person on the bench with a little bit of upside.
I thought this class was not good, and I still believe that. The Trey McBride, his numbers, like if you were just like putting these prospects in a spreadsheet, he was popping a little bit, and the draft capital was pretty solid. I put on his tape as a prospect, and I was not very sold on him. I don't think that he's like a true game breaker when it comes to athleticism, and he had opportunities late after Zach Ertz tore his ACL, and he didn't really do a whole lot. And this next year, we're going to be dealing with, I don't know, like Marcus Mariota plugging in for Kyler Murray, and then you have Kyler Murray with ACL, and this kind of organization is kind of in a problem spot. I'm not sure if Trey McBride's going to be good enough to kind of overcome that. Some of the other names like Bellinger, like literally a full-time player when he was healthy, and he was never on the fantasy radar. Isaiah Likely has a chance, but that would require Mark Andrews to leave. I think Greg Dulcich probably has like the best chance. And I thought he was a fine prospect. He's got some athleticism. He's definitely somebody that they can put into the slot. And a lot of their, like, if it's a 2 tight end set, he's going to be the guy off the line of scrimmage. So I have some intrigue there, but all of a sudden you're tying yourself to Russell Wilson for these next couple of years, and the GM could get fired this next year, and all of a sudden you're resetting with everything. The 2 players that are like definitely sleepers that I kind of have some optimism for is obviously Chiga Kwanko. Austin Hooper is a free agent or a cut candidate. I forget, one of the two. There is no wide receivers. Robert Woods is a cut candidate. They're going to be resetting at quarterback, so this could be a really bad situation for him. But he's got some juice, and he was kind of a boom bust prospect. I think that he has some upside. And I think my deepest sleeper here would be Jake Ferguson for the Cowboys. He was somebody that, like, back in like 2018 when I was doing college blurbs for RotoWorld, he was somebody I was always writing up because he was flashing as like a full-time player for Wisconsin, and he kind of progressed, maybe not the same trajectory as we would like, but he was getting playing time for the Cowboys, and Dalton Schultz is a free agent, and I think he's out of there. And all of a sudden, you can be the starting tight end for Dak Prescott, and Dak Prescott and the Cowboys have had tight end ones for multiple seasons now. And I don't think that Dalton Schultz was ever like some electric player. So I think Jake Ferguson would be like deep sleeper. But I think ultimately all these players in like best ball and all these rankings will be like tight end 14 to tight end 28. And maybe 1 or 2 of them have a couple back end seasons here. I think we're like hoping for like a Dalton Schultz or like a Jonnu Smith type of run. I don't see any TG Hawkinsons, no even like Noah Fant, none of those types. I think we're dealing with like tier 3, tier 4.
Yeah, I mean, it's best to set expectations at a realistic level, right? We can get excited all the time, but not everything is going to come up, aces every single flop. So, I mean, I love that the 2 names that you put in are actually on just complete opposite ends of the spectrum when we were talking about them coming in last year, right? Chiga Okonkwo is a pretty fantastic athlete and very dynamic. I don't know that he'll ever profile as the primary option, the every down, 100% tight end, right? But that, we've seen a few of these players be able to pop with their athleticism, that even if they are 70-80% players, they may be able to find their way, right? Again, we're not talking about someone who's going to be tight end 7, 8, 9, but somebody that, like you said, Jonnu Smith was a great name. Can you come in? Can they have some upside? Can you get them in the right matchups? And I do really think that, man, I'm a Niners fan. I watched that game. Dalton Schultz did not do himself any favors when it came to getting paid this offseason.
Yes.
And you're right. And if it is just an opportunity here, Ferguson is a complete he's a complete dart throw right there. But I think they have Hendershot too. Another guy that they've drafted recently that it kind of reminds me of the Dalton Schultz and Blake Jarwin, right? Like that was the other one.
Yeah.
You kind of have to guess the right one, but tight ends are so system dependent. And if you're giving me a shot at a guy who's going to get tight end 6 numbers, and you can get him for a 4th round pick, literally nothing, I'll take that out. I'll take that shot. If it hits, it's great. If it's not, I wasted nothing.
Were you guys on Jake? Just am I misremembering this? Like Jake Ferguson at one point was like somebody that we were like definitely considering as maybe somebody that could have been a maybe 2nd round pick, or am I crazy?
No, you're remembering that. And the thing is, he was on the Devy radar real young because people thought he might have came out after his redshirt sophomore year.
Yeah.
And there was talk that he would have been a day 2 guy. And then he kind of stayed in college for a while, right? Each year we kind of expected him to be, declare, and he didn't, and he went back and he went back and he went back. And then he kind of was a little bit of a forgotten man, and then you started hearing a little bit of buzz before the draft, an interesting day 3 type guy. And, I think Dalton Schultz is a nice player, but I think some team is going to overpay him, who just has a lot of cap space and doesn't have a tight end, and whatever, whether it's the Texans, pick a team that has a lot of cap space, and I think he's gonna get a decent sized contract, and I think Dallas probably knows what he is and what he brings to the table, and
they don't have money either. Yeah, even if they like him.
Yeah, and if they're gonna find a way to finagle, and sometimes teams do it, if they're gonna find a way to finagle, I think they're gonna bring in help at wide receiver and not give Dalton Schultz whatever $10 million a year, $11 million a year, whatever the case may be. I think they could probably look at Ferguson, Hendershot, draft another guy. We're talking about this draft class, and I know we're not going there tonight, but if you listen to all the major draft people, the Daniel Jeremiahs, the Dane Bruglers, all of them. A lot of them think 5 tight ends are going in the top 50 picks. 5. Like that's a staggering number. So like that would be 5 before we had the first one last year. Because if I remember correctly, I think McBride was like maybe in like the 55 range or 57 range, unless he was earlier than that. But so we might have 5 before we even had one last year. So it's gonna be interesting.
I think the thing with Ferguson, right, and just as you remember a bit, like, yes, he really popped early, right, just as far as like that go-to target. But I think it's the athletic testing that that wasn't really there for the upside. And we saw that, I think, with a guy like Jalen Weidermeyer, right? Again, just one of those Debbie darlings. That production was off the charts. And then when you run that athletic testing and you run like, I don't know, what was it, a 5 flat 40, something that just absolutely tanked his draft stock. I do think Ferguson is that good underneath threat. And again, we just kind of go, it's the easy comp, the Jason Witten style guy. And the reason that that's a great comp is because it's the role that Dallas has been using their tight ends in forever. And that's why we chase the Dallas tight ends. My biggest question, and again, it could be fine, it could not be fine, but is that's a great, McCarthy tight end, right? But if they decide to really shake things up, if they bring in a Sean Payton or some other style who's looking for, the Jimmy Graham style athlete, to actually make a difference at that position. I don't know if Ferguson will fit the mold as well.
No.
He might be coming in and blocking more, and we might not see him be that outlet type receiver that we've seen from guys like Schultz. So that'd be the only risk there. But again, like I said, you're not, we're digging deep here, right? Like you're throwing a 4th round pick for a guy that, somebody be like, sure, I'll trade you, I'll take your 4th, I'll draft another tight end here. And I think that with Ferguson in Dallas, I think you have outs there that will pay off, and I think it's worth the risk.
Yeah, the upside, obviously we want the athleticism for fantasy tight ends, and that's like definitely part of like predicting top 5 tight ends. But a second part of this is just we're talking about scoring touchdowns, and like if you have Dak Prescott for the next 3 years, which basically their contract situation is, if you're on the field at all, like you're scoring 4 or 5 touchdowns every single season. So I think that's kind of where his upside case is. And just my kind of general rule for tight ends is, in order to be a top 5, top 6 fantasy tight end on a season, you got to be playing in 1 wide receiver or 1 tight end sets. And then if you go to 2 tight end sets, you better be the one that's not staying in to block. And that's where you get like these Travis Kelce seasons. Even better if you're going to be in 3x1 sets, if you're going to be the lone receiver on the isolated side, that's where you can find these things. And then someone for like Chigakwanku, are you going to be in the 1 tight end set, or otherwise you're going to be kind of stuck in this, like he's running some routes, but he's not in like all the red zone looks and stuff. So I think that's something I need to figure out with Chig in particular is he good enough in line to block, and not just for anybody, to be good enough to block for Coach Vrabel, who's probably cares about this stuff more than just about anybody.
Yeah, and I think that's the one negative about Chig. I just don't think he's going to be much of a blocker. So you're going to have to, for him to be fantasy consistent, they'd have to get really creative and use him in a variety of ways to manufacture touches. And listen, if they manufactured a tight end enough touches, we'll take it, right? Because tight ends are very, very, ebb and flow each week, and he can make a big play. But it would be very, unless they make a point to find a way to get him X amount of touches on most weeks, I think it'd be hard. Because as you said, I don't see a scenario, right, where he's going to be the guy who's asked to be in there on all the time, right? Especially with their run game and their power run offense that they focus on. So I think it's going to be hard for him to get to that level. But interesting player. We liked him before the draft just due to the athleticism and the intrigue. So he's someone definitely following closely. And Ferguson, two sleeper guys there that we're high on here as well. Let's round out the night and close it off with a little bit of quarterback talk. You kind of alluded to Kenny Pickett a little bit before that, maybe he's a little bit better than we even thought. So why don't we talk about a little bit more? I'll let you go a little deeper into what you thought about Kenny Pickett's year, maybe where you could envision best case scenario for him if it hits in terms of fantasy. And then let's bring in like kind of like the wild card here. If the 49ers go to the Super Bowl or win the Super Bowl, how are we looking at Brock Purdy heading into this offseason? Because nobody's got a better cast of offensive playmakers around him than the 49ers do. And he's shown the ability to run that offense. How do we appropriately value him? Does it change based on how far each week he goes? Like, how are we kind of thinking about the Brock Purdy situation, where we stand right now prior to the NFC title game?
Yeah, it's so crazy because if he throws 3 interceptions and they score 8 points, then like all of a sudden we could throw out all this stuff. Just curious, where is Trey Lance versus Brock Purdy in dynasty rankings? Just like the difference between those two. I'm sure Lance is ahead, but that gap's probably closing. My Brock Purdy evaluation is he's on a great run right now. There are some interceptions that should have been caught by the other team that have not been. I think that's clouding some of the judgment, but the scheme, I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo isn't all that great, and he's been a quarterback too at times. So I think Brock Purdy's interesting just because the offense and this skill group is signed long-term, like Ayuk, Debo, Kittle, CMC. I don't think any of them are leaving. Same thing with Trent Williams. So whoever wins that 49ers job is going to be fantasy relevant. Obviously, Trey Lance brings 1,000 more rushing yards than Brock Purdy would. So I would still be swinging for the fences on him. But yeah, Brock Purdy, I'm nervous that there's just all of a sudden going to be a 2 interception game and then some of the buzz is going to fall out. But he's a playmaker back there more than Jimmy G ever was. I don't think he's going to be as consistent over the long term, but maybe him scrambling around, just letting Brandon Ayuk finally get open downfield is not the worst case scenario for him.
Jeff, any thoughts, as the resident 49ers fan here?
I mean, I don't want to take us all off track here, just talking about Brock Purdy, and that's a good conversation for another time. I did try to look up here, Hayden. You kind of thought, like, where is Purdy relative to Lance in the QB rankings? Okay, one source here, Lance was still kind of a QB 13. I think people are looking at upside rushing, right? I looked, Jimmy Garoppolo showed up next at QB 26, and I don't even know if the markets have caught up, or maybe the markets just still don't believe in it. Purdy was off the charts. He just didn't even show up. Right. Which is crazy because, even at the worst, he's going to be the second quarterback on that team, and backup quarterbacks are worth something, right?
Yeah.
Worth more than, I think, even a Jimmy Brissett or Jacoby Brissett kind of thing. It's an easy summation for me, right? Purdy's played himself into an opportunity for a shot, and they are still committed to Lance. They drafted Lance because they saw the upside there. If you made me bet, I'd still bet that Trey Lance starts more games next year than Brock Purdy does. And I'd even bet that he was the week 1 starter. I think both are more likely, but that's not to say it's a non-zero chance. And they like what they've got. This is all, to me, it just says Jimmy G's gone, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. And I really hope we don't see a 3-pick game. Not one, because I'm a Niners fan too. I love the story that Brock Purdy's like putting together here. If you see him in the Super Bowl, which, it's a non-zero chance. Like it's not, that team around him is so good. I still think this is kind of closer to the Nick Foles kind of story that you get, but I don't know.
I mean, the difference is Nick Foles was older, so like there's some like theoretical like mystery box kind of with Brock Purdy. And Nick Foles didn't have these weapons under contract weapons. This is like all expiring contracts, and that's kind of where the upside case is. So, like, to me, this like, what is your dynasty league? Is it a super flex league where like maybe like the ceiling doesn't matter as much because you just need starting quarterbacks at that point? Or is it a 12-person league, regular standard quarterbacks, where ceiling is basically all that matters? Like Mac Jones as the quarterback 20, even though we're going to expect a couple more seasons of him at that level, doesn't really get you into the starting quarterback mix where you need to be shooting for kind of ceiling. So I think kind of really depends on if it's super flex versus one quarterback. And to me, that the difference is like stability matters in super flex, and upside's basically the only thing that matters in standard.
Really good summation, I think, of really where you're going to want to push your chips in either kind of those situations, because it is risky to push your chips in on Trey Lance at QB 12, QB 1 prices. And then again, just, but if you're in a 1 QB league, you don't have to pay at quite as much. That upside's there. I think my one final thought when it comes to the San Francisco quarterback situation, because I know you're all going to be looking at me as the resident 49er fan, to weigh in here. We've seen players play well like Nick Mullins, right? And we've seen players play well like, I'm blanking on, the other guy they drafted, the non-Nick Mullins guy that we
Beathard.
Yeah, Beathard, CJ Beathard. He was like a 3rd-round pick too, right? Yeah. So, look, I think Purdy has eclipsed what those players have done, right? Very clearly. But I bring them forward as an example to say that, there is still growth that needs to happen to come forward if Purdy is going to be a starting caliber quarterback. Now, we've seen him play really well. We've seen him play well for 7 games here, and I have been really impressed with, you mentioned it really well, Hayden, just how he's created. He has done more than Jimmy Garoppolo has for this offense. People threw the Mahomes Purdy comp right with that one sideline pass that Ayuk dropped. And it was phenomenal. Like that is not a play that Jimmy Garoppolo makes. So it's 7 games, and we've seen this up and down carousel every single time with every single incoming class. I mean, we had conversations about, is Kyler Murray the QB1 in Dynasty after his hot start, a year or two ago? And development isn't linear. We say that all the time here, right? Teams are going to have to catch up. Purdy's going to have to adapt. If he's even given the shot, San Francisco will give him the shot to continue to grow. It's going to be a competition. He's going to have to earn his pay all the way through the playoffs. And yeah, it's can you continue to grow, right? Can you continue to grow as a player? That's the one thing that we're not good at doing. We can really talk about what this player's strengths is, what his weaknesses, where he's good, what would help him, what his surrounding cast, offensive scheme. And what we can't do, and I don't think anybody can do for you right now, is say what this player's going to do on the second, third, fourth step of his growth, right? That's why we missed on Tom Brady, right? That's why Tom Brady is the GOAT. He wasn't the GOAT in his first year, second year, third year, right? It's just that he always got better every single year. And it's an anomaly. We can't say that Purdy's going to do that, right? We can't say that anybody's going to do that. We can't say Josh Allen's going to do that. I mean, heck, Burrow's been doing that. Herbert was doing that. And then Herbert took a step back, right? So that's what makes this really hard, right? You have to play the odds. I love the way that you approach this when you're talking about, what you're thinking about for next year, what you project for next year. We've talked about it with all of these different positions. And now we're trying to talk about 3 years down the road, right? And so that's my whole thing on the San Francisco quarterback. It's going to be noisy this offseason. We're just going to enjoy, as a San Francisco fan, I'm going to enjoy a playoff run. I'm not expecting anything from this point on, right? Philadelphia is an amazing team. Let's see what Brock puts together. They have a shot. They're a good team, and everything's gravy from here on out.
I will say the narrative changes about the offseason if Brock Purdy beats this loaded Eagles team and then beats Patrick Mahomes or Joe Burrow. Like, I don't know if it starts as an open competition next year. We'll leave it there. If he loses this week or in the Super Bowl, maybe, because then Shanahan could look at it as the same way Garoppolo could get me there, but he couldn't win, which is what led them to why they went all in on Trey Lance. But if he gets over and wins it, I think the narrative changes a little bit. Hayden, last thing, we mentioned it before. I just wanted to kind of hear your response. Kenny Pickett, do you see a scenario? Could he put together, some fantasy viability in a Kirk Cousins way, in that couple of good peak years that Andy Dalton was fantasy viable? Or do we think kind of like what we've seen from Mac Jones? Where do you kind of think maybe Kenny Pickett and his trajectory could go here? Obviously a lot of growth still to be had, like Jeff was talking about, but maybe where do you kind of envision Kenny Pickett in a year or two?
So just as a prospect, as a reminder, 94th percentile EPA in that final season. I know he was older, but I mean, like, some of the analytic numbers were pretty strong for Kenny Pickett. So last year, the numbers were not nearly there. So it's kind of what matters more, that one kind of outlier year as a prospect, or was it last year? It's kind of somewhere in between. I don't see him being the Kirk Cousins in the pocket guy. My kind of comp was kind of hoping that he would be like Ryan Tannehill, who can throw the ball on the move, could probably get you 400 rushing yards. I don't have the numbers in front of me where Kenny Pickett was, but I think he struggles in the pocket and is actually good outside the pocket. And I think that he's pretty accurate. So we're dealing with mobility and accuracy are my two strengths for Kenny Pickett. The rest of it is below average, and there is a cap ceiling just because I thought his arm strength is fine. It's not great. It's, I think, starter level, but not enough to get to your like Justin Herbert's, any of that stuff. So I think there's a path for him to be fantasy's quarterback 13, 14, somewhere in there, but it's going to take some offensive linemen, maybe an entirely new scheme, and we're not getting that this next year. And if the scheme is bad and the offensive line is bad and he just kind of copy paste this next season, he's probably not going to be the quarterback in 2024. So it's a very hard place to be. I'm guessing the dynasty community hates Kenny Pickett. It seems like everybody trashes on him. So maybe there's a buying opportunity just based off of price. But I think a lot of things have to go right for him to be Ryan Tannehill, though I do think that there is a path for him doing so. Just hoping that they get the offensive line squared away.
When you say Ryan Tannehill, just follow up. I mean, when I think Ryan Tannehill, I think, okay, play action efficiency, right? And so, I don't have those splits in, but it sounds like you've kind of looked into this.
Mm-hmm.
Do I know you're worried about Canada. Is Canada, Matt Canada, just not rely on the play action much? Or
this is the problem.
Yeah.
So I think that stylistically, what Kenny Pickett does reminds me of Ryan Tannehill. But Matt Canada, they were 29th in play action rate, and they were 25th in neutral pass rate. So this just comes back to chicken or the egg. Same thing with George Pickens. Is this offense the way it is because Matt Canada, or is it because he doesn't trust Kenny Pickett in these ways? And like traditional, like under center play action stuff, that requires to turn your head and then be able to read the field post snap. I don't think that's where Kenny Pickett's strengths is. I think that's actually where his weakness is. And I think that we kind of put him in a box where he's this supposed to be this in pocket quarterback. I don't see him in that way at all. They always run these bootlegs. They get him like with these non-traditional quarterback drops. And I fear that's because they also see the same thing where he struggles in the pocket. But at some point you have to overcome that. And this next year, I would like them to at least try. I would like to see him fail in the pocket off of play action stuff, because nobody's just doing sprint outs to Deontay Johnson 4 yards downfield and expecting to put up an explosive pass game. So it really is just a chicken or the egg situation with all these players. Najee Harris, I think, is the same way, where we know he gets the volume. Is it because of the bad offensive line? Is it because they don't have a normal offense? What's going on with Najee Harris? Deontay Johnson, we think that he can possibly be an 1,000-yard, 10 touchdown guy, but he's just been not hitting his ceiling. Who is at fault here? And I fear it's actually Canada, and he's back for this next year. So very tough situation. I think Kenny Pickett's got this next year, and that's it. And I'm a little bit nervous for him.
Yeah, and I think we have really started to realize over the last X amount of years, whatever time frame we want to put, that these young quarterbacks, what they're asked to do in the offense that they are working with, the coaching, the scheme, it is so significant. Like we just talked about Brock Purdy for a while, right? If he was in a lot of other places, would he be having this success right off the bat?
Oh, no.
Probably very close to no. Here in New York, I've watched every snap of every play of Daniel Jones's entire career, and we went through pretty good with Shermer, then horrific with Jason Garrett. Not a surprise. We all kind of saw that coming. But Joe Judge, that conservativeness paired with Jason Garrett, basically he became a shell. And then we saw Brian Daboll slowly get it back to at least be a quarterback that's intriguing, right? With the athleticism, with the mobility. They really relied on the play action at times, and then they finally started developing the other parts of the game as the season went on. So Kenny Pickett needs that. A lot of young quarterbacks need that, right? Like, even in New England, they're bringing back Bill O'Brien, and maybe he's not the best, but he's better than Matt Patricia and Joe Judge as the offensive coordinator. So maybe Mac Jones next year, gets an upgrade. Obviously, it's not Josh McDaniels, but it's better than what he had this year. And maybe the Patriots finally get him some weapons too, and create the better, structure around him for sure. So these young quarterbacks, always fun to talk about them. Hayden,
real quick, just now that you mentioned Daniel Jones, I think Kenny Pickett is like directionally on that path, though Daniel Jones, I think, has better traits. And like he always had those traits, and he was more of a traits-based prospect, where Kenny Pickett, he had kind of the numbers, and then we're kind of seeing where the traits are going to kind of fall up. But Daniel Jones, athletic, can throw. I think he is accurate for the most part, but it was so much of the in-pocket decision-making that was troubling. Now, I do think that Daniel Jones can run it for an 80-yard touchdown. I think Kenny Pickett might not be able to do that. I think that DJ has a little bit stronger of an arm, but I think that's kind of what we're hoping for with Kenny Pickett. But like you said, Brian Daboll was the one, and Kafka were the one to unlock them. Is Matt Canada going to be that guy all of a sudden? I'm probably out.
No, probably not. And they seem set on having him. Like it's kind of baffling that
I can't believe it.
Yeah, that they don't, open themselves up. And like, I think so many teams should really, it seems like so many teams want to keep things that they're comfortable with. These coaches want to keep, people that they know, people that they've worked with, when they really should be trying to bring people from organizations that are doing creative things. And, I know here in New York, there was a whole big article like 2 weeks ago in The Athletic on how Brian Dable went about creating his staff. And it wasn't just people he had worked with at his different locations. And he had targeted Kafka, knowing that they couldn't block him if they offered him the offensive coordinator position because they had Eric Bieniemy there. And like things like that, like you need coaches. And Mike Tomlin's a great coach. I don't want this to all fall on Mike Tomlin, but I do think there's got to be some looking deep and being like, what can we do to put him in the best position to succeed? We see what some coordinators and coach and offensive minded head coaches are doing with certain young quarterbacks. Well, we have a young quarterback. We need to create that infrastructure. We don't have an O-line for him. We don't have a great scheme for him. We're not really setting him up. And as you said, then the time starts ticking. And if he doesn't produce, do they look to turn the page? So it's a never-ending cycle with these young guys that we want them to produce at a faster rate, but sometimes they're not really set up, to be successful. And then maybe they have to be like Ryan Tannehill, go somewhere else where then the infrastructure is better situated for them. So great conversation all the way around tonight. Hayden, please let the audience know where to follow you. If you anything you got going on at Underdog as the offseason, kind of starts kicking into high gear that you want to share. And then just thank you so much for coming on tonight. Absolutely great time.
Yeah, this is a total blast. Down to come on whenever. For Underdog in particular, my pitch will be, we have fantasy football drafts every single day. Like right now, you can draft for the next season. In a couple weeks from now, we will have a $1 million tournament for 2023, and that will close before the NFL draft. And for the Dynasty community, it's probably the best format that we have for you, because you're going to be drafting players before they get drafted. So there's going to be some big risers, some big fallers. So if you think that you have some actual predictive power here, this would be the place to do it. And it's a 1 year instead of Dynasty, so there's a little bit of wrinkles onto it. So that'd be my pitch. You can use promo code The Show. That's my podcast if you aren't signed up on Underdog. But I think the Dynasty community would like to try out some best ball drafts, and we'll have a huge tournament coming up.
Guys, make sure you're following Hayden. Make sure you're following all the great work that they're doing over there at Underdog Fantasy. So on behalf of Hayden, on behalf of Jeff, and their sound and tech engineer, David Nicano, thank you for joining us, and we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.